honor to have you all here. This is going to be the second workshop of the European Network of the Philosophy of Mind and Language. It's an internal workshop, so it's not, advertised outside. It's just to get to know people from all our centers and have, long and calm discussions on the topics we love. So we are very happy because from the 12 centers that right now are members of the network, there are members from 9 centers coming. So we are happy with that. And we're going to have 9 talks and 9 commentaries on those talks and then discussion. It's going to take 2 days. Today we're going to have 4 talks, tomorrow 5. So far we only have 1 cancellation, 1 commentator cannot come today, so hopefully he will send his comments and somebody will read them. Otherwise, this is Pedro Santos, who canceled yesterday. So otherwise, the program, as far as I know, is the definite one. The one is published in the website. So, and the structure was 45 minutes for the speaker, 10 minutes comments, 5 minutes response by the speaker, and then 15 minutes open discussion. Well, we need more. We don't have time restrictions for the room, so it's up to us how long we want to make each session. But well, just in case, we'll start as scheduled with 1 hour, 15 minutes each session, 15 minutes break, etc. So it's my pleasure to introduce a friend and colleague that works most of the time here at the Institute, but also at Carleton University. And we talk on the essentiality of thoughts and reference. Please, Eros, your turn.
Thanks, Kepa. Many thanks for having me here. And when I start, I've been working on topics similar to that for quite a long time. And when I start preparing for this talk, when Kepa twisted my hand, and they told me you have to do it. And so it came out what the paper on the talk is based on. It turned out to be quite long. So it's structured in 5 parts, and I will probably have time just to go to part 1 and 2. And if time remains, I may say something about the third-person perspective, but I will not deal with point 4 and 5, which is a bit more linguistics and has to do pretty much dealing with logophoric pronoun, big pro, and Castaneda's notion of quasi-indexicality or quasi-indicators. So this is something which is, I will not go in. So, well, the starting point, it seems to me, around all the debate on the décès, well, the starting point has been inspired, I guess, it comes from Chisholm, among others, is what roughly the so-called the irreducibility thesis, which has been highly criticized, for instance, by Lycan and Bohr and Lycan in a paper in the 70s, when we criticize Castaneda's indicators and quasi-indicators. But it seems that the irreducibility thesis can be spelled out as follows: essential indexical I now and here cannot be explained away or replaced by co-referring terms without obliterating or without destroying, to use Perry's terminology, the cognitive impact they use, or, well, something gets lost if we take away an essential indexical. Well, as I understand, the reducibility thesis can be spelled out in kind of 4 subtheses, and which each deserve to be examined. So first is what essential indexical are irreducible, because we are intrinsically perspectival. The second subthesis is that essential indexical are what contributes in the explanation of agent-centered behavior, which is something that come out, for instance, in Perry papers on the essential indexical. Third thesis is that essential indexical cannot be replaced by co-referring terms, both in extensional context, because we destroy, to use Perry's terminology, nature in intensional content or in that clauses. And the fourth thesis, which I will not have time to go in, but I nonetheless mention, is that from a third-person perspective, the use possibly only implicit of a essential indexical or of essential indexical can be attributed by means of quasi-indicator. Namely, Castaneda's notion of quasi-indicator is a way, as he put it sometimes, it's a way to freeze someone else's indexical reference. So, well, what I'm trying to do here, I'm trying first of all to do some, or to focus on some cognitive, what it can characterize, or what it characterizes, the cognitive base of perceptual thought and reference, which seems to me it's a way, one of the way, from a cognitive viewpoint to put forward or to see what underlie some thought about essentiality or essential indexical. The basic idea is what we are cognitively built to grasp species object of our surrounding in a indexical way. Notice that here I use indexical between quote because it needs to be spelled out. So our indexical access to the external world, the basic grounding of our thought, needn't be represented in our mind by us entertaining a token representation of an indexical. So that's the reason I use indexical here within quote. So, and another point that seems to come out from a cognitive perspective is that in our perceptual encounter with the external world, there is a kind of a direct, cognitively unmediated contact between our mind and the object we come to have in mind, to borrow from Donnellan's terminology. So, well, to sustain this point, I will rely on some philosophical first armchair reasoning before turning to some empirical evidence that comes mainly from vision. So one of the problems is that I'm not interested and I won't deal with so-called, in discussing now Donnellan's approach, I will not deal with so-called speaker reference, semantic reference as it has been used by Kripke in his criticism of the referential use of description by Keith Donnellan. So my starting point is Donnellan 66, distinction between the referential and attributive use of description. In particular, what I would like to focus is on what drives Donnellan characterization of the referential use of a description, be it a definite description or a indefinite description. So in such a uses, or in a referential use, Donnellan suggests that the notion of having in mind play a predominant role. It's one of the key notions in his Donnellan's characterization. Roughly, the use of a description in the referential way, or one use a description in the referential way, following Donnellan, is when one has a object or an individual in mind. To do so, the speaker must be in a privileged cognitive relation with the referent. The speaker should be, if we borrow from Russell terminology, acquainted with the object. Furthermore, and more importantly, at least from Donnellan's perspective, so one can successfully select an object of discourse and pass to his or his her audience the object she has in mind using misguided definite description. Misguided description, this is an important point, it seems to me, in Donnellan's So actually, most of the examples of the referential use proposed by Danielon rest on the use of description that mischaracterize the referent. So one can have a man or a woman for that matter in mind and talk about him here using the man with the martini, and even if the relevant man or woman is not drinking martini. Besides, at least following Danielon, if by accident there is someone else, another man drinking martini on the opposite corner of the room, that uniquely satisfies the descriptive content of the description, the speaker still refers to the man-woman she has in mind. The man drinking martini in the opposite corner is out of the thought episode and communicative situation. Well, here it seems that if one pick up an individual, have it in mind, and successfully pass to his or her audience the individual she got in mind using a misguided description, it seems that the individual in question is not apprehended and referred to via the descriptive content expressed. Well, the individual, in other terms, is not grasped in a satisfactional way. Namely, the relation between the voiced description and the referent is not mediated by the latter, by the referent, having to satisfy the descriptive content. The relation is direct. Well, the speaker's aim in such a case is to identify, to pick out the relevant individual. The description can be seen as being just an essential tool the speaker uses to draw the attention toward the referent she got in mind. The audience, furthermore, the audience can easily identify the referent, the individual, the relevant individual, even when she realizes that it does not satisfy the description used. So the acquaintance relation between the thinker or speaker and the relevant object is direct. It's unmediated by descriptive and conceptual content. It is, to use Russell's terminology, knowledge of things. This can be understood, at least it seems to me, as a paradigmatic case of so-called, or what has been called, Dere knowledge. The latter is more basic than knowledge of truth, which, according to Russell, unlike the former, which knowledge of object is inferential and as such rests on concept manipulation. Well, one of the points to stress is that the connection a thinker makes with the object she is acquainted with, the object what enters his mind or her mind, is unmediated by the encoding of the properties the object may instantiate. So, as Donnellan stresses, when a description is used referentially, it comes close to be a Russellian genuine name, namely a name that, based on the acquainted relation, puts the thinker in direct contact with the referent. The having the object in mind is both independent and previous to the choice of the linguistic expression used to identify it. Well, in Donnellan paradigmatic cases, perceptual individuation precedes linguistic individuation. So it's what Kaplan, in a later paper, say about this kind of worth mentioning. Donnellan's paradigms for the referent use of a description are cases in which the speaker has the intended referent in mind prior to the formation of the description and in a way what is independent of the description used. It is this independence that allows the description to mischaracterize the referent. The user intends what if push comes to show, the individual in mind trumps the individual described. So this main idea, at least it seems to me, underlying Donnellan's notion of having in mind, can also be cashed out using Fred Dretske, distinction between seeing and knowing. a subject may see Jane without recognizing her, without seeing that she's wearing a red hat, and so on and so forth. We can, in other words, differentiate an object from its immediate environment without appealing to concept or description we will use to individuate it. Well, and here is to quote Dretsky, visual differentiation is a pre-intellectual, pre-discursive sort of capacity which a wide variety of beings possess. It is an endowment which is largely immune to the caprice of our intellectual life. Well, an important point to bring home is that having something in mind is different from recognizing and categorizing the thing one has in mind. This notion, at least it seems to me, must be kept apart. If we conflate them, we would undermine Donnellan's notion of having in mind. At least so our perceptual experience, our coming to have an object in mind and to refer to it in our thought, episode, and linguistics interchange is not conceptually mediated. If we were disembodied organisms like angels, for instance, we would directly pass what we have in mind without appealing to language. Well, it is on this basis, it is on the basis of this unmediated contact what one referentially use a description or a complex demonstrative as a or qua-Russellian genuine name to pick out an object of discourse and pass to his or audience the object she got in mind. So, to further stress this idea, we can imagine someone perceiving two indistinguishable scenes, like in Austin's 1992 tube puzzle. For instance, you imagine what someone is looking with a binocular, and well, actually, it's called this kind of binocular has been built by Zeiss long ago, and on which you don't know whether what the scene perceived by the right hand is the same as the scene perceived by the one. And here you can generate a Frege puzzle like this is this. It can be informative when you come to realize what you are looking. Both eyes are focused on the same scene. So in such a case, the perceiver cannot distinguish the scene in a non-relational, or I would prefer to say in a non-perspectual way. Well, and here Birch, discussing a case like that, or a similar case about scene, he say, in a recent paper, he say, intuitive and scientific considerations rule out attributing to the perceptual system representation like whatever causes with representation. The perceptual system cannot itself discern the difference between the two scenes by means of its general representational abilities. Since the representation function partly to mark ability, the general representational ability should be type identified or marked by semantically general representation which apply to both things. Scene. The individual see and perceptually represent particular that cause the perception in the context. So a context-bound, semantically singular element is needed to account for the finability representing the particulars in front of it. So roughly in our perceptual system is, we could say, indexically, and here I still use indexical within quote because I will try to spell out what I mean. And our perceptual system is sort of indexically embedded within the perceptual scene. It is this embedding that underlies, as I understand it, the notion of essential indexical. It also, along this line of thought, what we should understand, Castaneda claimed that indexical reference is personal, ephemeral, confrontational, and executive. And it cannot be reduced to non-indexical reference, to what is not confronted. So the philosophical picture highlighted here, find its counterpart and foundation, it seems to me, in empirical studies, in particular in study concerning vision. While it relies, if I am on the right track, on Pilichin, on Zeno Pilichin, theory of situated vision, and specifically on his notion of fins, or fingers of instantiation, understood as indexical or as essential mental indexicals. This is sort of the cognitive underpinning upon which we should understand the notion of acquaintance that underlies both Russell's genuine names and Donnellan's having in mind, as well as the philosophical work promoted by Castaneda, Perry, Lewis, and Co., and so on. The main idea is what some of our mental representations are irreducibly direct and they say, for, and here is a quote from Pilichin, a theory of situated vision suited for the dual purposes of object recognition and the control of action will have to provide something more than a system that constructs a conceptual representation from visual stimuli. It will also need to provide a special kind of direct, preconceptual, unmediated connection between elements of the visual representation and certain elements in the world, like natural language demonstratives such as this or that. This direct connection allows entity to be referred to without being categorized or conceptualized. So, indexing visual object is a precondition for the grounding of visual concept. Our visual system is automatically attracted by the visual object. This, should be stressed, is not a unidirectional relation. The visual indexing is a prerequisite that allows an organism to open a channel of information that permits it to gather information from the particular index. So the indexing relation is where the mind and the world enter in a mutual relationship. This partnership cannot be severed, for it is independent of our willpower and intellectual vagaries. Well, this we must emphasize once again is an automatic relation. The index object impinges itself into the receptive mind. So the essence of direct reference, to borrow from Genoveva Marti, in general, and indexical reference in particular, is grounded on our cognitive perceptual system. So it's another quote from Pilichin, mentioning Perry paper on the essential indexical. Philosophers like Perry have argued that demonstratives are ineliminable in language and thought. The reason for the ineliminability of demonstrative in language and thought also apply to visual representations. Not only can we represent visual scenes in which parts are not classified according to some category, but there are good reasons why at least something must be referenced in this preconceptual way. If we could only refer to things in terms of their category membership, our concept will always be related only to other concepts. That's concept for categories, and will never be grounded in experience. Sooner or later, the regress of specifying concept in terms of other concepts has to bottom out. Traditionally, the bottom out was assumed to occur at sensory properties. But with sense data view of concept has never been able to account for the grounding of anything more than simple sensory concept and has been largely abandoned. The present proposal is that the grounding begins at the point where something is picked out directly by a mechanism that works like a demonstrative. Visual indexes do the picking out and the thinking that we, and the things that they pick out in the case of vision are what many people have been calling visual objects or proto-objects. So further empirical evidence pointing forward or toward the irreducibility of indexical thought is also furnished by robotic studies. You got L'Espérange and Levesque argue that for a robot to function in the real world, in the real environment, its representational system has to incorporate indexical reference. In particular, it must incorporate agent-centered way to represent the world. In other words, for a robot to function in a real environment, its system of representation must be able to deal with indexical or agent-centered way of representing the world. So I now try to spell out what does it mean, or try to articulate out some idea about this kind of notion of agent-centered behavior, and to do so I will rely on to use the notion of viewpoint or point of view. So we must distinguish to begin with between entertaining and indexical thought. If you buy into the language of thought story or mentalese, an indexical sentence in mentalese, and distinguish between entertaining an indexical sentence in mentalese and entertaining a non-indexical perspective of thought. What is a sentence in mentalese? That, although context sensitive, it contains no indexical expressions. So this distinction helps capturing Perry's idea what one can entertain a thought about something even when one is not representing the relevant thing. So one can successfully interact with the external world without having to represent oneself as the agent, as the self of the action, let alone the now and location of his/her action. So Perry's notion of self-locating belief, it seems to me, should be understood along this line as well. In particular, one can entertain a self-locating belief without having a self-representation nor a representation of the location and time of the action coming into his/her mind. This is so insofar as one thought is embedded into the situation. The situation itself anchors the thought without the subject having to represent the anchoring mechanisms. So yet, the relevant thought guiding someone's action depends on his/her viewpoint or perspective. The distinction between indexical and perspectival thought should highlight this feature. So the notion of viewpoint, as I understand it, encapsulates the egocentric perspective an agent has on some contextual salient aspect of one's surrounding, be it an event, an object, an individual, or what you have. Although the notion of viewpoint may be best explained from a third-person perspective against the background of indexical reference, it doesn't reduce to it. A point of view, as I understand it, captures the non-conceptual subjectastic perspective one entertains on his/her surrounding. As we saw, Pilichin Finst relate us to visual object in a non-conceptual primitive way. Our perceptual system makes us integral part of the situation we are acting in. This immersion is intrinsically perspectual, could characterize it as de se immersion. So, to use an example from Perry to illustrate this kind of situation, well, in uttering "it's raining," although the corresponding thought doesn't represent the relevant location via the indexical here, it nonetheless concerns the relevant location insofar as the thought is embedded into it. So understood, the notion of viewpoint should capture the way one automatically cognizes one's surrounding without being constrained by conceptual representation. It should capture Paris idea, what we can have thought about something without representing that very thing. So to borrow from Paris, again from Paris terminology, the viewpoint accompanying many of our thoughts is unarticulated. Whether it's going to become a constituent, it's another story. But I intend to stress here is unarticulated. That means unarticulated in someone's thought. So the thought an agent has on his her surrounding that guides his her action are intrinsically perspectual without them having to articulate indexical representation. When I came to grasp, for instance, the thought that the salt is on the left of the pepper and acts accordingly, let me grasp it, I don't have to entertain the thought that the salt is to the left of the pepper regarding my perspective. The relevant perspective participating in the success of my bodily movement, namely me grabbing the salt, need neither be voiced nor represented. It's because my thought is embedded into the relevant situation, being mine and me being in such and such a relation vis-a-vis the soul, what I act successfully. It's because my perceptual system is situated and because I am biologically built the way I am, I automatically act and grab the soul the way I do. So it's along this line that we should, I guess, understand Pellichin's view that the situated vision involved in the dual purpose of object discrimination and action control cannot merely rely on the mind constructing mental representations. Well, it must also provide a direct, automatic, and preconceptual connection between the elements of visual scene and the mental correlate. So things are what contribute in bridging the gap between the mind and the world. The conceptual representation involved in perception rests on pre-attentive impingements. The perceiver automatically attend the perceived object. When a subject engages in some inferential reasoning about the relevant object perceived, his or her viewpoint can be actualized. It can work, to borrow from Barr's law terminology, as an ad hoc concept. A speaker-thinker perspective is latent in his or her interaction with the real world, yet it can come out and reach the reflexive mind. To characterize this feature, we can introduce the notion of ad hoc indexicals or ad hoc indexical thought. So, the notion of viewpoint I introduced can be cashed out by ad hoc essential indexicals. So, recent studies in social cognition seems to support this picture as well. And here's what Barth and Chartrand say: most of a person's everyday life is determined not by their conscious intention and deliberate choice, but by mental processes that are put into motion by features of the environment and that operate outside of conscious awareness and guidance. Well, furthermore, Baumeister's notion of the duplex mind, namely the distinction between a conscious system and an automatic unconscious one collaborating in determining and guiding our action, also points in favor, or at least it seems to me in favor of the view that most of our action and joint activity don't rest on conscious cognitive processing. So our mental processes are automatically connected with the environment or situation we find ourselves in. So the general moral, it seems, is that self-control computing play a minimal causal role in the guidance of our everyday action, and so therefore, what our thought being situated play a crucial role when we come to the understanding of our linguistic interaction in particular and joint activity in general. So with an articulated perspective, thought can be reached reflexive mind and be articulated using the essential indexical, I, here, and now. So the viewpoint latent can reach via ad hoc concept, can reach the reflexive mind and be articulated or spelled out using essential indexicals. So the latent perspective at work when one thinks what the salt is to the left of the pepper can, upon reflection, reach the reflective mind and be articulating the thought what the salt is to the left of the pepper regarding my viewpoint. In a communicative act, one may have to readjust his or her own perspective. It is in this respect that the relevant viewpoint can come to the front as a ad hoc concept, and therefore what a perspective of thought can be transformed into a indexical thought. This is, I think, one of the main lessons we can take home from the work of Castañeda, by Castañeda, Perry, and co. on essential indexical, self-locating belief, and agent-centered behavior. This is what constitutes the cognitive grounding of the DC. I think I stop here. From the third person perspective here, what I wanted to say was merely that exploiting the notion of empathy and on the way we are empathically connected with our conspecific, and from work done by the Parma people on mirror neuron and so on, and Meltzoff and etc. Well, what we are also being empathetically connected with the other, we can grab someone else's perspective, someone else's viewpoint, and that at the end of the day, this would also be the cognitive underpinning of the existence of logophoric pronoun, big pro, when it's understood, when he forces big pro, when he forces a DC, or also the cognitive underpinning of quasi-indexicality, because quasi-index indicator, she star, he star, and so on and so forth, by Castañeda, are what help us from a third person perspective to grasp someone or to attribute to someone else's a indexical or DC thought. So I stop here. Thank you.